I didn't give a plot summary, which I sometimes do for books, because it's not a book that you can quickly or easily summarize, and even if you do, that doesn't necessarily tell the whole thing. But how do you describe it as simply and as quickly as possible, just so we can get a bearing for what it's about? Let's move that down a little. Oh, wow.
Okay, well, I'm sort of in the middle of a book tour, so I've sort of had to do this, so yeah. I'll see how I do here. A bunch of birds in the middle of nowhere find a unexploded bomb and think it's an egg, and then a plane crashes and they think it's a giant bird, and they spend about 600 pages trying to figure out what's going on.
That is it. Now, but within that, there's a lot going on. So this is a book that, and I think you've talked about how when there's a book that's mostly pictures, it really opens it up to all kinds of meanings. What did you want people to come away thinking? Because on the one hand, the book's called Big Questions, and you've got all these birds, and the birds spend a lot of time philosophizing and talking and having these really deep questions that are never really answered. Are those the big questions, or is that just kind of a side show for what the real big questions that you wanted kind of to get across or ask?
Well, hopefully you come away thinking the birds are actually asking sort of dumb questions. Sort of like we all sort of ask a lot of dumb questions in our lives.
Not me. These are all brilliant.
But what I want people to come away thinking, I don't know, I guess basically, wow, what a great book. I want to get this guy's next work. No, I just want people to kind of, I want it to be a good ride. Like, I want it to be something that people enjoy. Like, I want to make work that is provocative and makes people think about their own lives, but also is truly, like, engaging and entertaining.
See, when I read it, it put me in, and I'm not going to be good at describing it, but it put me in a very particular and I think enjoyable mood. Do you see it in some ways as a mood piece, if you will?
Yeah, I try to sort of, people often come away from it and they're kind of like, wow, like, they characterize it as being dark, which I always sort of feel like it totally is, but I feel like I hope that's not what you, like, everything you got from it, because it's also, like, funny.
It's very funny.
And hopefully, and goofy, and, like, fun to read.
Well, the birds time and again will be discussing something, and then another bird will say, all right, well, let's get something to eat. That's kind of the way it goes.
Yeah, and I feel like that's sort of how life is. It's like we're confronted by these sort of grand, issues all the time, but really the bottom line is, like, how close is the nearest bathroom, and, like,
You've
can I get a good beer?
You've talked about how the book is often about how meaning can shift, or the way people interpret something can shift, which goes in some ways against, I feel, the way people typically are. And I'm not just talking about politics, but people are stuck in their ways or in their ways of thinking about things. So how is this book about kind of shifting meaning? And when in your life have you had moments where, hey, all of a sudden I'm thinking differently about something?
Yeah, that's definitely something that I'm interested in, and that really is sort of what the book ends up being about, is, like, all the birds have a slightly different idea of what the significance of these events are, and the human characters also are the one that has a brain. And they're basically all wrong. And I kind of feel like we're basically all wrong about the grand scheme. Like, you can't find two Christians who agree on, what the Bible means. You can't find two...
Not even Bachman and Rick Perry?
I guess you'll have to have them on.
I've been trying. Busy.
I'll give you the number later. yeah, it's like you can't find two Democrats that like are on the same page about everything. Like none of us can agree, so therefore like we're probably all a little bit off. And that I think is kind of something that is important to keep in mind when you're dealing with other people. Like you might be wrong too, you know.
Well, does that mean that there is a right answer, or that there is no right answer?
That means that there is no right answer.
There is no right answer.
I mean, you know, whatever, maybe. Don't quote me on that.
So why birds? I mean, in the book, there are a couple of humans. There's a guy who is, I guess, an idiot. I mean, I don't mean that in like he's, like we colloquially say it. He's an idiot. He can't really speak. Then there is his grandmother, who doesn't last too long. And then there is a pilot who's the one who crashes. And in both cases, I mean, the idiot obviously doesn't speak, but the pilot doesn't speak much either. He basically rants and raves when he does. And it's the birds who are doing the talking, and a few other animals. What did having animals talking allow for you, and why were birds in particular so central to the plot here, or to the book?
Well, the book started out a long time ago. It's been like 15 years since I did the earliest strips in the book, and at that point I didn't realize I was working on a book yet. It was just I was finishing art school and had sort of abandoned or was beginning to abandon the painting and sort of installation art that I was doing there, and started doing these little gag strips about birds, and they sort of just like popped up. But I think the reason that I responded to them and I kept working with them and then wanted to expand a story with them is that they are so kind of small and simple, and they're like these little blank slates. Mm-hmm. I think it's a thing in cartooning in general where the cartoons that work the best, the characters that people identify with the most, are sort of the simplest. It's like Charlie Brown is basically a circle, a couple of dots, and a little like U for a nose. And there's something about that simplicity and that like super basicness that allows the reader to just sort of impose their own, you know, psyche on. As far as like why birds, why not something else? I never really paid that much attention to birds before. And now, once I started working on this story, I did. And I used to live across the street from Humboldt Park. And once I got into this book and this story and started paying attention to birds, like I started noticing there's amazing bird life all over Humboldt Park and all over the city, actually.
What are they up to?
Eating fish. I saw this kind of amazing. I saw a great blue heron the other day in Humboldt Park in a little pond, and it was just standing on one leg, and it had a fish in its mouth, and it was just like sort of pretending to drop the fish, and then it would grab it and drop it and grab it and drop it and grab it.
I think it was just playing games with the fish?
Yeah, it was totally fucking with the fish.
Wow.
And then finally, like, the fish started to stop flopping around, and it kind of died, or like expired. And then the bird started dropping it into the water and grabbing it out. So it was like fucking with it even more. It's like, you want some water? Oh, no. And then it was totally dead, and the fish like tilted its head, or the bird tilted its head back and choked it down.
I feel like that story is a great encapsulation of the way you think and your work in general. It's bleak, it's dark, and yet it's funny. What interests you about kind of because several of your works are like this, about kind of predator and prey, and that the predator and prey is not just I'm going to eat you and you're dead, but there's something deeper and more subtle going on.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know, one of the things that's come up since the book's been done, I've been talking about a bunch more, is like, why nature? I mean, I guess that's like the bigger question of why birds, like why, because it is set in this sort of like empty landscape with just trees and grass and like a little river or whatever. And I feel like that's, again, like kind of gets to the very basics of existence. It's like we eat and we gotta shit and we gotta like look out for predators. Like we don't really have to look out for predators, but like there's death and you're sort of confronted with death, and that like being confronted with death forces you to sort of examine your life more. And so telling a story about birds or about, little animals, talking animals in the middle of nowhere. It's like that's just a way to kind of personify the sort of basics of existence. And
well, the pilot, for example, does not give a damn about the birds. In fact, he wants to hurt them whenever they kind of, because they're interested in him. They're not angry with him, but yet he wants to either shoo them away or eventually kill them.
Although actually his first interaction with them is to throw a piece of his sandwich out to them. So he's basically totally indifferent.
Right, okay. But then he becomes cruel later. No?
Well, they're at the end they're kind of fucking
pages.
with him, like, or he thinks they are, you know.
He thinks they're fucking with him.
Well, yeah, I mean, if a whole group of birds like came up right here and were just like watching me, that would make me nervous.
So you say in the afterword that this book, during the time that it took to write all of the episodes of Big Questions, you went through a number of different things. You lived in, I can't remember the numbers, but you lived in 8 different places, you lived in 6 different cities, you went through 2 engagements, a divorce, you dealt with death, which you've written about. How did writing Big Questions, how was it in any way, maybe it wasn't, a grounding for you, something that was always there, a stability? And then how did what was going on in your life affect the direction that the book took?
I think it's sort of slightly unbelievable for me to say that all the kind of crazy shit that happened in my life didn't affect the book, but that feels like that's actually the right answer. Like it feels to me like the book, once I got started and sort of had a basic idea of what the major plot points were and stuff, it was just out there and I was just doing my best to get it down. Mm-hmm. And there are actually moments in the book. There was a very particular passage in the book that, I mean, you referenced my fiance died in 2005, and there was a big break where I wasn't really working on the book. And then when I came back, I was working on this passage that I had written, 2 years before she'd ever been sick, about this bird going down into this weird underground cave and trying to find his lost mate and like bring her out. It was sort of a retelling of the Orpheus myth or whatever. But there I was, like 6 months or a year after she had died, like doing this thing that I had already written a long time ago that was basically totally describing the experience I was going through. So it was less like my life was affecting the book. It was almost like my life was following the book or something. It was weird. And there's actually a couple other weird instances of that too.
Like what are some other examples?
I don't know. I don't remember getting attacked by an owl. I don't know.
Did you really get attacked by an owl? No. When did the first kernel of the idea for the book come to you?
Well, I was doing the kind of gag strips like 96, 97, 98. I think probably 99 is when I actually sort of was like, I want to turn this into a story. And that was when I introduced the human characters and started writing sequences that did not end in a punchline, and started to kind of hint at like larger things happening.
Do you think readers, and I know there's obviously plenty of readers who follow, I guess, underground or alternative comics, but do you think readers still expect the punchline? And how do you use that to play with the reader or to play with your story?
I think that's interesting. I think the comics audience doesn't necessarily expect one. Maybe the mainstream audience that's just coming to comics now for the first time sort of doesn't know exactly what to expect. I still like to do that. I mean, I actually ended the book in kind of a gag strippy kind of way in order to go back, like, come full circle or whatever. So I still like that. I like the fact that comics is rooted in that sort of like lowbrow goofiness. And that even though I want to like address bigger issues and tell bigger stories, like I still like playing with that form. So.
Well, my last question, and this is something that you might not have an answer for, but it's something that I've been thinking about as I read the book. And I don't read a lot of comics. And I find myself that I have trouble, and once I get into it, I enjoy it. But initially, I have trouble reading a book that is basically visually based, that pictures are the main thing. But I have a 6-year-old, and I was thinking about how kids, most of the books, at least at that age, are picture books. And they're amazing at the way that they pick up on every single detail in the picture, and it takes me a lot of energy. He'll point out something, and I'll be, oh, I didn't notice that. I just was going through it. So what do you think it is about either kids that makes them receptive to that, or what do we lose as adults, that so many of us lose as adults, that makes it initially harder to get comics, to get cartoons?
I think it is, I mean, it, you know, like you said, kids' books are picture books. So kids are sort of primed to experience things visually more. I mean, you know, little kids don't read, so they're really focused on the pictures, and there's somebody next to them, like, telling them what's going on. I think that reading comics is a little bit of a skill, you know? It's like, it's something that you pick up when you're a kid, and then if you read a lot of comics, you continue to exercise it, just like any, you know, using any language or any sort of whatever cultural medium. And I think that is a little bit of a barrier, like, that I wasn't really aware of when I started doing this, that some of my friends who don't read a lot of comics, like, it's a little bit more work for them to absorb everything. And with my book, like, there are whole passages that are totally silent. Right. And I try to, I mean, when you're doing that, like, you've got to be very careful and very conscious of, like, every single action being sort of articulated and, you know, making it as easy as possible for people to read the pictures.
Well, I thought it was going to be a quick read, not many words. But then I realized that, well, if I do that, I'm missing the point.
And I think the other thing is, like, wanting to make it interesting enough that people feel like after the first read, or after, you know, the first read of a section or whatever, if they feel like they didn't quite get it, they're actually interested enough to want to go back and take a look again, and that they'll get something out new from it on a second reading or a third reading or whatever.
Well, the book on the first reading was great. I really enjoyed it. And it's for sale out there from Quimby's. So I want to thank you for coming. Anders Nilsen, the book is Big Questions.